Have you ever wondered what a city feels like the moment before a miracle shatters its darkness? Imagine the salty air of a Greek port, the heat of waiting eyes, and the press of a crowd thirsting for hope. There are stories that carve themselves beneath your skin, the ones that begin in the quietest hours and end with the thunder of a world forever changed. This is one of them. It has a story not just about agony and death, but about the way one man's final breaths could ignite a flame that would sweep through stone streets and heal 1,000 ancient wounds. Before Rome tried to silence Andrew with unspeakable cruelty, he was just a fisherman staring into the splintered light on the Sea of Galilee, unaware his hands rough with old nets would one day grip the future of a whole city. Long before any crowd screamed for blood, Andrew's mornings began the same as the generations who came before him. Waking before the sun dared to cross the horizon, he'd feel the sticky coolness of lake mist on his arms as he and his brother, Peter, checked old knots and repaired lines frayed from the previous night's toil. They rarely spoke as boats scraped softly against the pebbled shoreline. This was a world only fishermen understood, where fortune could turn with a wave and families clung to whatever the net surrendered. Every day was a battle between hunger and hope. Not much ever changed, except the sky. Somewhere beyond the edge of ordinary, something began to shift. That day the sun rose behind bruised clouds, spilling red veins across the water. Andrew thought his eyes played tricks, but the figure that approached through the mist wasn't a dream. Without introduction, Jesus' call struck that morning like a sudden squall. "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." The words hung in the air, simple yet so sharp they seemed to split Andrew's heart in half. Men were supposed to be cautious. They were supposed to weigh the risk of an empty catch, or the ridicule of neighbors, or debts that might swallow whole families. But Andrew, standing ankle-deep in the shoreline, did what makes sense only in the language of faith. Without looking back, without a word to his brother or father, he let the full weight of the net drop from his gripfish and all. The shock on Peter's face vanished into the background as Andrew dashed toward the new tide calling his name. There are moments when obedience isn't an act of recklessness, but of seeing differently. For Andrew, it wasn't an escape from poverty. It was a leap into something unexplainable, a call that made the world suddenly feel narrow, and the mystery in a Galilean stranger's eyes seemed vast. What did he sense on that windswept shore? Maybe it was raw authority, a kind of gentleness that bruised with its power, or the quiet certainty that if he stayed behind, he'd shrivel into someone else's version of himself. For Andrew, the cost of staying was greater than the price of leaving everything behind. Though many would remember Peter as the bolder brother, with the voice that could command a room, it was Andrew's silent courage that set the first ripple through the world. He was the earliest to leap, to trust, to bring others after. The scriptures would later record his decision with a single decisive word: immediately. And so, the man people called manly, whose very name whispered of courage, walked with empty hands into a future that would demand everything. What followed were months of sleepless travel, miracles that defied even the oldest villagers' memories, and nights spent sheltered under stars instead of thatched roofs. Every new dawn brought a swelling crowd, the sick who had not walked for years, mothers cradling feverish children, thieves, the forgotten, even those who'd given up praying to stone gods. Wherever Jesus and his closest few went, the weight of possibility pressed in like a coming storm. Andrew didn't bask in the glow of limelight. He was always the one in the background, ushering people toward the spark at the center pointing, introducing, quietly serving as living proof that no one was too invisible to be swept up in a revolution of love. Once he dared bring his own brother, the tempestuous, sometimes stumbling rock named Peter, to Jesus. In that act, Andrew set history's gears spinning. The fisherman's hand on his brother's shoulder would change more than both their lives. But what makes some men become legends is not a moment of courage, nor a single act of faith. It is what comes when standing between fear and purpose, when the price of loyalty becomes clear, and Rome tightens its grip. Years later, in the crumbling marble heart of Patras, Andrew awake at dawn, beneath a sky painted with the smoke of burning offerings. By now, his hands had healed dozens, carried water to the dying, soothed children racked with fever, and wiped years of sorrow from the faces of strangers. Yet Rome and her priests had watched these changes with suspicion that curdled into terror. In Patras, gods carved from cold stone towered above hungry children. Gold pooled at the feet of silent idols, while disease, madness, and despair coiled in the gutters outside temple walls. Rituals spun endlessly, expensive and empty. But Andrew walked through these battered streets as if he carried an unwavering light one, forged not from fire, but something stronger. Day after day, miracles happened where temples had failed. The first was a beggar, bones brittle and legs withered, unable to walk for longer than anyone could remember. In the city square, Andrew looked beyond the twisted flesh to the yearning in the man's eyes. With a touch and a whisper, strength poured into useless limbs. The beggar stood, then stumbled, then laughed, breaking open joy like the cracking of dawn. Crowds who'd gawked in curiosity became witnesses to the impossible. Words scattered faster than gold dust across Patras. Envy and wonder, fear and hunger, collided in the city streets. If this foreigner could heal what the gods could not, whose power did he wield? Offerings stopped. Temples emptied. The desperate and the lost chased rumors through alleys, hoping for a glimpse of the man who undid ancient pain. But in every city, power is never just spiritual. When hope takes root outside the reach of priests and politicians, it undermines the very ground they stand on. The Roman official, perhaps once secure, now frightened, watched his grip on the city slip thread by thread. Andrew had become more than a healer, more than a preacher. He was a threat. It was the conversion of Maxilla, the ruler's own wife, that finally shattered what patience remained. Her transformation was not a whisper, but a shout. The woman who had sacrificed to cold idols and wept alone in palace shadows found in Andrew's words the answer she'd searched for since childhood. Her public faith was not simply a personal betrayal, it was political. Suddenly, Andrew's fate was sealed. Rome understood that ideas were far more dangerous than swords. To silence the rising storm, an example had to be set, one so gruesome it would cauterize the wound opened in the city's heart. Andrew spent his final night behind frozen iron, the stench of rot and fear curling through cramped prison walls. The stones pressed sharp into his battered back. Yet even as chants and threats rose outside hundreds, ready to tear the prison apart if Andrew asked, he told his followers to lay down their weapons, to let the night unfold. "Do not hinder what needs to be accomplished," he whispered through bars. "My temporary anguish will lead to eternal glory." As Roman guards snickered, expecting to watch his courage crack, Andrew prayed and sang until dawn. To those who watched, he looked like a man already living somewhere the empire's darkness could not touch. The dawn that settled over Patras that morning was crimson, the kind remembered in legends where gods are said to bleed into the waking world. Metal scraped stone in the corridor outside Andrew's cell, echoing with each heartbeat of those kept awake by dread and hope alike. The city, raw from so many miracles, seemed to hold its breath, uncertain whether to pray for mercy or for the strength to face Rome's wrath. Outside, word of Andrew's coming execution had swept through alleys and marketplaces like wildfire. Whole families gathered in the damp pre-dawn gloom, clutching scraps of cloth, bread, or trinkets, each desperate to catch a final glimpse or perhaps receive a word, a blessing, anything that might shield them from the storm to come. Inside the darkness of his cell, Andrew did not shiver, though the chill clawed through the worn fabric of his robe. He had witnessed the fear of death in hundreds of eyes before, had touched the trembling hands of the dying, had seen breaths thin out into silence. But now the taste of his own mortality was sharp, new, laced with a knowing defiance. He knelt, not in terror, but almost in awe. The floor was cold, the scent of mildew thick, yet his prayers rose above stone and iron, weaving through walls as if they were smoke. Each word was laced with love for those he would leave behind, and a fierce, unbroken longing for the world that waited just beyond the agony of mourning. When the guards finally wrenched the door open, their faces were taut, avoiding his gaze. They had seen what hope could do when pressed into the palms of the desperate, how it could unravel authority and loosen every chain that power forged. Andrew stepped forward, and the light from outside broke across his features, painting him in a globe of otherworldly and very much alive. The people who waited in the street did not cry out or riot as Rome had feared. Instead, a thick hush descended, more potent than battle. It was the reverent quiet that follows only in the presence of the sacred or the condemned. As Andrew was led through twisting streets, memories flickered behind his eyes. He saw, as if in dream, the faces of those he de-healed, the limping child who had sprinted from his mother's arms towards sunlight for the first time, the old merchant whose sight had returned in a shimmer of tears, the women who had buried their shame beneath layers of grief and found themselves lifted into laughter by a single touch or word. He remembered every gratitude-soaked embrace, every question that trembled with desperation, every moment when it seemed the world might shift beneath their feet and tumble into peace. The Romans, masters of spectacle, had chosen the city's busiest square for his sentence. They had prepared a cross unlike the one so many had seen before, a monstrous, X-shaped instrument meant to stretch a man's suffering, to slow surrender and wring every ounce of anguish from the body. And yet, as Andrew beheld it, he felt no hatred. There was, instead, a strange serenity, as if he viewed the world with new vision. Each stone, each shriek of a gull, the shimmer of heat on Roman armor, all spun from a web far vaster than fear or pain. They dragged him forward. Whispers rippled through the growing multitude, stories, swelling like a tide around their ankles. A man who had cast out demons, who had walked with swindlers and lepers, who had cracked open the iron shell of despair with a simple act of kindness. Some in the crowd wept openly, their grief a raw chord that cut through the roar of Rome's soldiers and priests. "Why do you not curse them?" a woman near the front cried, clutching her emaciated daughter in shaking arms. "Why do you sing when they are about to kill you?" Even as rough hands jerked his arms toward the wood, Andrew's voice emerged clear, steady, stronger than the city's noise. "I do not suffer for myself," he replied, his gaze gentle, searching the crowd. "I am but a servant, and love is stronger than iron or death. Do not mourn for me. Hope is not made of flesh, and cannot be buried by nails." With skill honed from many such executions, the soldiers bound his limbs, stretching Andrew's body across the arms of that X-shaped cross. They did not use nails, choosing instead thick, coarse ropes that bit into his skin, drawing blood and clouding his breath with pain. Yet his lips framed prayers, one for each person he saw in the crowd, one for each friend and enemy, one for the trembling hands that tied each knot. For hours they left him thus, hoisted high, a spectacle for all to see, a fisherman, battered by Roman cruelty, yet lifted by something no weapon could touch. Time spilled forward. The sun climbed and sagged, shadows growing long and restless on the square's stones. Some in the crowd called for his release. Still others spat accusations, fearing what kindness might cost them, wondering what legends a dying man could birth. Beneath the cross, children sat silent for the first time in days, drinking in every whispered prayer or word that drifted down. As the sky bruised with evening, the Roman official himself crept close, curiosity gnawing at the crust of fear. "Where is your power now, fisherman?" He jeered, voice echoing brittle and sharp. "Has your God come down to save you? Will your miracles lift you free?" Andrew's breath rattled, but still his answer fell, gentle and unwavering. "My king wears a crown of thorns, not gold, and his victory is not of this world. Rome may scatter my bones, but the heart that beats in this square will outlive all your empires." That night, as the first stars kindled above Patras, no one could sleep. The floral scent from the city's gardens mingled with the iron tongue of blood and brine. People huddled together, whispering stories, half-remembered healings, kindnesses repaid 100-fold. The strange healing pain of watching love refuse to die, even as life was stripped away, strand by strand. Only Andrew, his body racked and stretched, floated in a calm deeper than death. His eyes, half-lidded with exhaustion, still kindled with a joy none could fathom. He saw the city in all its brokenness and beauty, its wounds and wild longings, and he knew whatever came at dawn, the world would never be as it was before. The first pale streaks of morning sifted through a sky blurred by sleeplessness and dust, painting the faces of those gathered beneath the looming shadow of the X-shaped cross. Time seemed to unravel, stretching each heartache and gasp across endless hours. In the center of Patras, a city now divided between fear and wild longing, Andrew's body hung as both a warning and a living testament. Fisherman draped across cruel wood, his arms and legs bound by thick fraying rope, every muscle aching with the slow throb of exhaustion and pain. Yet what startled the onlookers most was the absence of accusation. As the day ground forward, the governor and his men had expected curses or the animal rage of a dying man. Instead, they heard song. Sometimes, in the moments when the Roman guards fell silent, a strange chorus rose above the marketplace's hush words barely whispered, prayers billowing and reforming with each shallow breath. Andrew spoke to the crowd as if each listener's secrets pressed cool and heavy against his tongue, as if every wound in the city had passed through his own skin. Those close enough to see the lines etched on his face saw not only the agony, but also fierce clarity, the joy of a man with nothing more to lose, nothing more to hide. "O beloved cross," Andrew murmured, "for years I have longed for you, for the nearness to my Lord that only your sharp embrace can bring. Let every drop of suffering here become a seed for mercy, yet unimagined." Some in the crowd staggered back, covering their faces. Others pushed closer, weeping, clutching each other fiercely. Word rippled through the streets. The Christian song did not die. Hour by hour, even as the heat pressed against stone, as sweat and blood glistened in the brutal sun, Andrew's voice reaped silent comfort for the sick hope, for the disappointed, and trembling courage for those who had known only the emptiness of old gods carved from stone. Late in the afternoon, the governor passed by once more, his cloak brushing the dust. He was furious at the muttering in the streets, at the officials who whispered with anxious eyes, at the wives who swore by the power of this dying man's words. Yet Andrew simply smiled, that slow, exhausted smile of someone who stands already inside eternity. "Your empire will vanish," he told the governor quietly, "but the memory of love that does not yield will live in every child's laughter after you are dust." As sunset bled across the sky, something in the city changed. Mothers brought infants, holding them up for a blessing. The wounded came limping, carried, shuffled on makeshift crutches or on the strong shoulders of friends. Every ailment, every sorrow laid open in the hope of something shining. If Andrew could speak, even half-choked by parched lips and raw lungs, he did. "Do not fear for me, little ones. This pain is brief. Your kindness, your faith, will outlast any suffering." For 2 days and nights, Andrew endured agony and did not demand release. He continued to call out, refuse silence, and scatter hope with every word, choosing to see the bone-deep sorrow of Patras as fertile ground for a trembling, newborn joy. From every alley and battered house, Men and women pressed closer, unable to look away. In the nerves and sinews of the city, something had shifted. The old ways trembled as if at the edge of earthquake, and the eyes of Rome, jaded from cruelty, found themselves for one heartbeat pierced by something cleaner than fear. All through the second night, lanterns burned as the faithful kept silent watch. The sharp tongue of incense hung in the air, mingled with salt and blood. Outside the governor's palace, those once too timid to speak dared now to pray. Andrew, battered and swollen, felt the veil between worlds thin. He watched dawn unfurl over Patras one final time, the city's ancient roofs glowing gold, and within his battered chest tears gathered not from pain, but from the boundless aching sweetness of having glimpsed the cost of love, a cost more precious than any victory won by force. Still, he whispered blessings. Still, his voice rang thin and trembling. Children of Patras, remember, kindness is forever. The body passes, but mercy once freed can never be chained. And in that hour, as the horizon burned with the third sunrise since his torment began, the city learned that the death of a single fisherman could overturn the ages and set the broken world trembling toward redemption. Andrew's body was a canvas of suffering beneath the pale sky, but the world seemed to slow around him. Time itself had become strange, each heartbeat unspooled like a lifetime. The crowds that gathered in the square had changed too, once restless, now reverent. Some wept openly, their tears washing away the fear that had hollowed their spirits for so long. Others simply stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the man whose endurance felt superhuman, whose words refused to wither with his weakening flesh. Children, usually too timid for such scenes of death, found themselves drawn to the edge of the crowd, huddled against the legs of their parents, watching with eyes wide and glistening. Vendors and beggars from distant corners of Patras set down their trays and cups, folding their hands and bowing their heads as if this final vigil was the holiest of rites. The city itself shuddered a deep, invisible quake under the weight of something turning, as if the heart of the world might crack open and spill hope into the guttered streets. Through the rolling hours, as suffering ravaged his frame, Andrew began to feel the borders between himself and those below dissolve. He looked down at their upturned faces, no longer strangers or spectators, but children, brothers, sisters all, swept into the same haunting melody. He saw in their eyes the echo of every story, mothers desperate to heal their sick, sons haunted by debts or regret, young women carrying wounds invisible to the world. In this crucible of agony, Andrew's prayers took new shape, no longer half-formed pleas for strength, but laments braided with longing, prayers that the suffering forged in his own body might bind up the wounds of an entire city. Even as the ropes cut deeper and the air grew thin, his mind flickered back to the cool blue of the Galilean lake, to the innocence of dawns, when all that mattered was the day's catch or a shared laugh on the water. He remembered the raw, unsteady joy of first following the stranger who had appended the quiet world of fishermen the taste of bread and salted fish beneath olive trees, the hush that fell when miracles rippled through crowds gasping for hope. What he would not give for one more morning of sunlight splintering on the sea, for the scratch of cedar oars and the singing of his friends. Yet he knew, with a heaviness that was also peace, that every thread of his story had been spun for this moment, so suffering would not be wasted, so love could speak without words. As the sun reached its zenith, Roman soldiers fidgeted in their armor, unnerved by the hush that had settled over the city. The officials who had prayed for a spectacle now glanced furtively at the crowd, sensing that the execution had not cowed the people, but somehow emboldened them. From the steps of the palace, the governor watched, jaw clenched, yet unwilling to command a final blow. It was as if all of Patras held its breath, waiting to see what would break first, flesh or spirit. Andrew's voice hoarse now, barely above a whisper floated down to the cluster below. If you seek to know what cannot be destroyed, let it be love. Empires will fall, stones will crumble, but what you forgive, what you give in mercy and hope, will dwell beyond any grave. Each word hovered, tilting on the edge of life and myth, refusing to die even as their vessel waned. In these hours, miracles of a subtler kind swept through the city. Where once neighbors had eyed each other with suspicion or contempt, they now pressed together in silent fellowship. Grudges melted, long-held debts were quietly forgiven, and the boundaries that had divided rich and poor, Roman and Greek, Jew and Gentile, blurred. For the first time in living memory, the city breathed as one. By evening, a hush more profound than morning's dread settled on Patras. Torches sputtered and flared as the breeze caught the scent of crushed myrtle, mingled with sweat and sorrow. Some in the crowd saw visions, glimmers of light around the cross, or the suggestion of wings unfurling just beyond the limits of sight. Others swore they heard music in the evening air, sweeter than any lyre or flute, a pulse that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Andrew, his body spent and vision swimming, smiled, not for his own release, but for the impossible yet now undeniable alchemy unfolding, the magic by which anguish, freely given, became solace for the multitude. His final joy was not the end of pain, but the knowledge that pain could be transfigured, that defeat could become a beginning. As the stars began to pierce the indigo veil above, the fisherman's last breath threaded itself into the tapestry of the city, a silent vow that suffering, when faced with mercy, could illuminate the darkness for generations yet unborn. Patras, bruised and trembling, would never again be as it was. Rome's power, sharp as it seemed, had faltered here, not against swords or rebellion, but against a stubborn, radiant tenderness that even death could not swallow. Night gathered above Patras with a hush so deep it seemed to muffle every clamor of grief, leaving only the distant echo of Andrew's last words, pulsing in the shadows. In the alleyways and porticos, the crowds who had refused to leave now sank to their knees or sat in silent prayer, the air thick with longing. The moon drifted high and pitiless over the cross, silvering the ropes that bit into torn flesh and painting the marketplace with ghostly light. Every stone, every shuttered window, seemed to absorb the pain and hope that had flooded the city these past days. Word began to drift behind closed doors. Some whispered that the martyr had not simply died, but that he had opened a wound in the city, a crack through which floods of compassion and courage now poured. Women who once passed each other in the market, without a glance, now pressed their palms together and shared tearful embraces. Those with bread shared it. Those with wounds, physical or hidden, sought each other out in the night, no longer ashamed to be seen in their need. Humility, like a new and holy fire, took hold where fear had reigned. Inside the governor's villa, the world felt colder, emptier, the walls dense with unspoken dread. The Roman official who had ordered Andrew's death could not sleep, tormented by memories of the fisherman's gaze clear and steady, even as his body failed. He replayed their last exchange again and again, hearing the gentle defiance of a heart untouched by all the machinery of Roman terror. He wondered against every lesson drilled since childhood, if it was possible to rule a city and lose its soul in a single dawn. As the night deepened, a handful of Andrew's followers crept through the darkened lanes. They moved quietly, avoiding the patrols of weary soldiers, and gathered beneath the cross. None dared to speak above a whisper. Each carried what they could: cloth for burial, fragrant oils, even flowers snatched hastily from gardens, petals still dewy with night. They looked upon the ruined body and felt their own courage scrape raw against the enormity of all that had happened. They moved carefully, reverently loosening the ropes that had become a crown of agony. When they cradled Andrew's body, it was not the battered limbs or bruised face they saw, but the serenity that remained, an afterglow of peace refusing to extinguish. The fisherman had suffered, yes, but suffering had not claimed him. Something impossible endured, something the empire could not name or defeat. The small company bore him away toward a garden on the edge of the city, hearts trembling with love and dread. They pressed through tangled vines and olive trees, laying the martyr's body in the earth as the first faint birdsong breached the horizon. There, surrounded by the hush of leaves and the promise of another sunrise, they sealed the grave, each whispering a final prayer that seemed to echo and swell within their chests. But burial was not the end, not in Patras. Even as mourning cloaked every home, a current of defiance, gentle, quiet, unstoppable, continued to flow. Those who had witnessed Andrew's final suffering felt transformed, remade as if their pain and longing had been woven into a single indestructible hope. And while soldiers stalked the streets searching for signs of rebellion, what truly grew in the shadows was harder to kill a brotherhood of mercy, a sisterhood of courage, knit together by the memory of a man who had faced the world's violence with open arms and an unbroken song. In the days that followed, the authorities ordered harsh crackdowns. Homes were searched, followers of the way were dragged into public squares and threatened, and spies reported every whisper that spoke Andrew's name. And yet the people did not bow. What Rome could not understand is that faith, once sparked, spreads not by sword nor decree, but by the mysterious bond of those who have suffered together and found themselves the stronger for it. The grave in the garden became a secret destination. Under cover of darkness, mothers brought their children to touch the ground where Andrew lay, whispering stories of his kindness, teaching little ones how gentleness could outlast even death. Fathers, long hardened by the struggle of earning bread, found their hearts aching with new desire, to build a world where no one would ever need to beg for mercy again. The spark lit by a single fisherman now leapt from soul to soul, weaving a tapestry of goodness across the bruised city. Andrew's death, intended as warning, became seed, the strange, wild promise that love poured out would never perish. And so, while Patras hummed with the menace of Roman power, beneath the surface ran a song fierce and sweet, the legacy of a man who dared to trade the certainty of nets for the shimmering risk of hope, and whose final breath became the first breeze of a coming resurrection. The dawn broke with a fragile quiet, as if all of Patras held its breath for what might come next. The small band of Andrew's followers gathered beneath the olive trees, their whispered prayers mingling with the morning air. Though his body had been returned to the earth, his spirit was anything but buried. Stories of his final moments traveled swiftly, carried by those whose lives had been touched by his unwavering faith and fierce kindness. In hidden corners of the city, people began to share a new kind of courage, a courage that did not roar with swords, but stirred silently like the steady pulse of a heartbeat. Mothers whispered to their children about a fisherman who had faced the world's cruelty with nothing but love, teaching that mercy was stronger than hatred and hope more enduring than chains. Old men who once scoffed now nodded solemnly, recognizing in Andrew's sacrifice a truth no empire's might could erase. The governor, cloaked in the cold armor of authority, found himself shadowed by unease. Reports reached him of gatherings in secret homes, of eyes glistening with renewed faith, and hands reaching out to heal instead of strike. He could not grasp how a man, silenced by death, could unsettle the foundations built on fear and conquest. The walls of his villa, once seeming impregnable, now echoed faintly with the whispers of revolt, not of violence, but of spirit. Meanwhile, the followers, scarred but resolute, began to carry Andrew's message beyond the stones of Patras. Journeys were made by foot and by boat, speaking of a love that bore every burden and refused to succumb. Each retelling grew like a flame passed from hand to hand, illuminating dark places where despair had settled. In homes and marketplaces, amidst laughter and tears, the seed of a new beginning took hold. And yet the cost of faith remained ever clear. Many had paid dearly, families torn apart, livelihoods shattered, trust sacrificed at the altar of suspicion. But every challenge only deepened the roots of the movement Andrew had ignited. It was not a fleeting rebellion, but a slow, steady revolution of hearts, marked by quiet acts of mercy, shared bread, and hands lifted in prayer. In the gardens where Andrew had been laid to rest, wildflowers bloomed brighter than before, as if the earth itself remembered and honored the man who had given everything. Those who came to visit carried stones and prayers, their footsteps weaving a path of remembrance and hope. Over time, the garden became a sanctuary, a place where sorrow met solace and the broken found healing. Years would pass before the world fully grasped the tide set in motion that weary morning, how one fisherman's sacrifice sowed the enduring promise that love could triumph over cruelty, that mercy would live on even when empires fell to dust. Andrew's story, carried on the breath of countless voices, became a beacon, a testament that in the darkest nights, the faintest light dawns an eternal day. And so, as shadows lengthened and the city stirred anew, the legacy of the man who chose hope over fear sang on a song no power could silence, a story forever woven into the fabric of a world reborn. As the years folded into decades, the memory of Andrew's sacrifice blossomed into something far greater than any had dared imagine. From the quiet gardens of Patras to distant towns and bustling ports, his story became a beacon, a whispered promise that even in the face of brutality, the light of mercy endures. Those who had once watched in silent awe now took up the mantle he left behind, not with weapons or flags, but with hands ready to heal and voices lifted in prayer and song. The movement sparked by Andrew's unwavering faith grew beyond the city walls, carried by travelers, merchants, and seekers. In every place touched by hardship or cruelty, his name stirred hope. Fathers told their children of the fisherman who dared to follow a stranger's call, a man who faced death with open arms and transformed the meaning of courage. Mothers found strength in the tale, teaching that love's power knows no chains, no borders, no final breath. Yet the path was never easy. Persecution's shadow stretched long, and many who embraced Andrew's message endured scars both seen and hidden. But each act of cruelty only deepened the bond among those who believed. In secret gatherings lit by flickering lamps, prayers poured forth like rivers, stitching communities together with threads of steadfast grace. The garden in Patras became a sacred place over time, not merely a grave, but a sanctuary of remembrance and renewal. Pilgrims traveled from near and far to touch the earth that had cradled the martyr's body, to lay flowers, to leave tokens of hope. The trees that once shaded this spot grew tall and strong, their roots intertwined like the stories of those who carried Andrew's legacy onward. Across centuries, empires would rise and fall, languages change and geographies redraw, but Andrew's message remained unyielding. It whispered through history as a testament that the cost of love is high, but the reward is eternal. That from the crucible of suffering can spring a world reborn, where even the smallest hands can cast nets wide enough to gather the dreams of countless souls. So it is whispered still, in every place where kindness triumphs over cruelty, where faith outlasts despair, where mercy calls forth the dawn. Andrew, the humble fisherman, lives on not only in stories but in hearts forever changed, forever hopeful. His final breath was not an end, but the first breath of a dawn that will never fade.